about abuse, but this side of it is particularly insidious. And the way to think about it is there is actually a developed and sophisticated industry out there that is focused on nothing but taking money from whoever they can reach, but especially older people. I got a call last week trying to have dinner, and I picked up the phone, and you could hear that babble in the background that tells you someone's about to offer to clean the ducts on your house, or so you had your dinner interrupted by that call, or gotten the call on your cell phone. And but this was a bit different. The person who was talking to me claimed to be from an Institute for Policy, and the question he asked was, "Are there any seniors in your household? Because I'd like to speak with them if they are." That was harvesting, and that's how they work. What they're looking for contacts, and then once they've got the contact, they sell the contact. Which, let me jump ahead and tell you, single best predictor that someone's going to fall victim to third-party crime is that they've already been victimized, which is why one of the best and most helpful things we can do is just ask people whether they've been victimized or their parents have been victimized. Now, I thought that what that was about was, well, if you've been victimized, it means you're vulnerable, and if you're vulnerable, then you may just repeat the same mishap over again. But it turns out that in fact what it is they sell the contact. And it's being sold highlighted. Yeah, this one works. So they're now going to become, so if once you've been victimized, you're permanently marked as a target. I've given you a definition of fraud. It's useful to have, but deceit, deception, or other objectively dishonest conduct causing deprivation or risk of deprivation. And cybercrime, really the best way to think about it is it's fraud that involves the use of a computer. And the computer, it can mean in a couple of different ways. So it can be hacking or phishing, where the crime is committed, as it were, against the computer directly. Or it can be that the computer is used as a conduit or a means of facilitating the crime, often harvesting information online that's used to build a profile of someone so that they can be approached and convinced to part with their money. Let me give you two examples quickly of what this looks like. We need to be careful. So I've been talking to lawyers about this topic as well, because when I get calls or questions in my professional life, it's often because someone has allowed money out of an account and they've discovered that the transfer was fraudulent. And there's reported cases that describe in great detail how sophisticated these guys are and how good they are at fooling professional people, including bankers, lawyers, and accountants, into accepting instructions to transfer funds, usually doing it by masquerading as a client who's established a pattern of facilitating electronic transfers through you. So if you're in a position where you are either transferring electronically or you're arranging for electronic transfers, you need to be particularly careful. And I've given you an example there that it's drawn from a reported case. The second example is called the granny scam, and we'll come back and talk about it some more. But that one works like this. Older person gets a call. She knows that her granddaughter is in Montreal. No association with Montreal, just pulling names out for the sake of the story. And granddaughter in tears says, "I'm in jail. I made a terrible mistake, Granny. I knew there were drugs in the car. I should have gotten out. I didn't. And now I'm in this awful place, and they're not going to let me out of here until I can produce $20,000. And please, please, please don't tell my parents." Granny transfers the money, and it turns out it wasn't granddaughter calling her, and the money's gone. In a more sophisticated, more recent version of the scam, they'll actually send someone to buy Bitcoin and transfer that instead of doing a bank transfer. Or they'll say to grandma, "Granny, I'm putting my lawyer on the phone." And the lawyer says, "You're going to go to the bank. You'll call me just before you go in. I'll tell you how to transfer the funds. They're going to ask you why you're making this transfer. Tell them you're putting in new windows in your house and you need to pay your contractor. So why are older people vulnerable to abuse? Older people are, the older we all become, the more exposed we are to it, and the less likely we are to report it. A big part of that is shame. People are just really ashamed. People who've been independent their whole lives and looked after themselves who get scammed are often heartbroken. They feel a loss of confidence, and they're concerned that if they tell other people that they've been the victims of a scam, that'll be the trigger and the excuse to deprive them of their independence. Older people tend to be lonely and isolated, and some of the scams, the cybercrime scams, are designed to spot and exploit loneliness and isolation. Declining capacity, which means people are just a little less wary and a little less able to protect themselves. But I don't want to emphasize that. What I want to emphasize is how good the fraudsters are at fooling people. There's a fear that they won't be believed. That's why when an older person says something's happened, we start out by accepting what they say and investigating it. Dependency is the last one. So that, when it comes to abuse, when you ask why would anybody put up, well, why would anybody put up with an abusive relationship? But it happens across the lifespan to all kinds of people. We all have people in our life, perfectly wonderful people, who have a way of always ending up in relationships with people who take advantage of them. Why would it be any different for older people? But then add to it isolation, loneliness, and dependency, and a slight decline in cognition, and you've got a fabulous target audience for fraudsters. I'm giving you a list of things. These are things that will often signal trouble in our relationship with someone. So we've already talked about it. You know that there's enough money, but there's signs of need, so the money's not being used for them. New friends, in scare quotes, especially if the person can't tell you how they met the friend or where they met them, or they tell you that they first contacted them online and they're in urgent need of money. And then there's a series of other things that come up, especially in our relationship. All of a sudden you can't contact the client, or the client who's always seemed to like meeting with you refuses to meet with you, or you get a third party who is playing an kind of unacceptable and inappropriate role in the relationship, either trying to control traffic or insisting that they be present for every meeting. Transfers to a new advisor following conflict. So you say, I don't think you should do that, and the next day someone says, oh, the money's being moved. And the biggie, unprecedented withdrawals or transfers without an excuse. So if you're seeing something unprecedented, the burn rate, something inconsistent with someone's usual and habitual mode of life, ask and probe a little bit. So I come back to, so now I'm focused on us again. What can we do, or what do we do wrong? And let me come back to this notion of innocent abuse, because it's really easy to counsel abuse or set it off without meaning to, and most of the time when it happens, it's because of probate fees. So you may have heard me say this before, probate fees are a boon to criminals. It's a great way to persuade people to do things with their assets that are not actually in their best interest for the sake of avoiding a 1.5% tax that they won't pay their estates will. And we all need to be saying to any politician who will listen, you need to reform this silly system and start charging a flat fee for probating wills so that everybody will do it, and there'll no longer be any incentive for older people to start moving their assets around in ways that invite fraud and make it harder to spot. Because we're all conscientious and trying to help our clients, we will all talk to them about avoiding probate fees. And what you need to be careful of is you're thinking, I'm just being conscientious and helping my client and the family pay less tax. The person to whom you're talking, especially if they already hold a power of attorney for property, is often hearing, oh, the asset's now mine. or the asset should be mine, or it's now okay to start behaving as though the asset is mine. So if you're giving that advice, and particularly if you're giving it in a family setting where it's going to be shared with other members of the family, you need to emphasize and be careful to say, don't think I'm saying that this means it's not mom's assets if she needs it, or that you're free to start treating mom as your banker, because you're not. Now, there are other ways that I see people in our line of work inadvertently either get themselves into trouble or invite trouble, and it all comes under the heading of failing to respect the appropriate boundaries between our business and personal relationships. And especially if you've been doing, I'm not the only guy in the room with white hair. If you've been doing what we do for as long as we have friends who are also clients, and clients who are also friends, and family members who are clients, and so on and so forth. You need to be really careful about respecting the proper contours of those relationships. So almost everybody is now subject to a rule that says you should not be acting as an executor or attorney for property or trustee for one of your customers or clients. Be careful when it comes to your family members, especially if you're also providing financial advice. I've actually had clients who are advisors who've ended up in a real pickle, not having actually done anything wrong, but because other members of the family who are up to no good realize that there's a whole bunch of ways to pressure someone who's registered. And so think long and hard before accepting those appointments. And even if you're in a setting where you legally can accept executor or power of attorney appointments from clients, my advice is don't do it. I've already said, but bears emphasis, we've got 2 tools in the arsenal that are really, really helpful when it comes to protecting people from abuse, mostly because what we're looking for is something that allows us, if we've spotted signs of trouble, to act. Right? The problem, if your client hasn't prepared anything, is something happens. We're all bound one way or another by obligations of privacy and confidentiality, and you're faced with something you can't tell. She's saying someone's stealing her money. Maybe that's dementia. Maybe she's telling the truth. I don't have access to her bank account, so I can't even see and check for myself what's going on. I need someone to help me. That's where this comes in. So the trusted contact person is just that. It's someone who you have permission to contact and say, hey, here's what I'm seeing. I'm worried. Can you help me figure out what's going on here? And then if there is something wrong, we'll talk about it and figure out what we're going to do about it. The attorney for property under a continuing power of attorney for property is actually a decision maker. So what can happen, let's imagine, there's a complaint that says she's stealing from me. You've got a trusted contact person. You talk to her. She looks at the account. She looks at everything else. No money's missing. Right? It's clear that nothing wrong has happened. It's a delusion. But something's wrong with grandma, and she's now in a position to take grandma to the doctor. Doctor says grandma lacks capacity to make her own decisions, and at that point, the attorney for property steps in and can actually begin making decisions. There's some basic rules that we can establish for ourselves and in our own practice that help head off abuse and help protect us against becoming the agents of somebody else's abuse. It happens in my practice all the time. Someone who's been calling me directly to give instructions for 20 years, and all of a sudden, somebody else calls and says, Joe wants to change his will. Boom, and can I go up? Right, clear sign of trouble. So you start by establishing a basic practice, which is meet alone with the client, or meet alone with the couple. Regular contact with the client. This is huge in terms of all the issues that arise in dealing with older clients and customers. The baseline is what tells you something's wrong. So we can get all fancy and talk about what's mental capacity and what's undue influence and all those things, But at the end of the day, what triggers the concern is something's changed and you can see it. Something's